Hello and welcome to the Hoop Heads podcast. It's Mike Klinzing here with my co-host Jason Sunkle, and tonight we are pleased to welcome to the podcast from Sports Stories with Denny Lennon himself. Denny, welcome to the Hoop Heads pod.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Mike. Hey, Jason.
We are very excited to be able to have you on the show tonight, dig into all the things that you've been able to do across the entire sports landscape. Easy for me to say. Let's go back in time to when you were a kid. Talk to me a little bit about your sports experiences growing up in Venice, California.
Oh, I can do that. Hey, Mike, I was hoping you give me just a second to recognize a guy out of your fella's area.
Absolutely.
Right. So, sadly, I lost a great friend of mine. His name's Roger Gowdy. He was the president and chief executive officer of the Amateur Athletic Union. He died over this past weekend, and I just want to give him a shout out. He was an Ashtabula boy. I think he played at Harbor High School there.
Ashtabula Harbor, yep.
Yep, and then he played football at Kent State. So I know
there you go.
There it is. He was a golden flash. And Roger was an unbelievable person that did for others for his life. Superintendent of schools in Madison School District, in addition to the Solon School District out your way. And then rose through volleyball. That's where I got to know him when I was working with beach volleyball with the Amateur Athletic Union some 26 years ago. And Roger rose up through the sport of volleyball to take over eventually as the president and chief executive officer of the AAU, in addition to holding that position in volleyball. And unbelievably accomplished guy, Dr. Roger Gowdy, but an even better person. He did nothing but for others, raising the kids that came under his programs and through his school districts. Great family man, and I lost a really good friend. And I just want to recognize him, and I thought it was coincidental, fortuitous that I'm on with a couple of Ohio boys. And my God, Dr. Roger Gowdy from the great state of Ohio, as I would often introduce him to crowds. And there he is. That's my guy. And so big shout out to a great Ohioan.
Absolutely. Our condolences to you and to his entire family. And obviously we never like to hear about the passing of people who have accomplished so much. And it's great for you to be able to recognize that, and we appreciate you giving him a shout out here on the pod.
Appreciate it, guys. So, yeah, you asked me about growing up in Venice. I was born like 64 range, so by the time I was about 8 years old, was one of the golden years in sports to be an LA sports fan, and I was a young. I learned to do my math by reading the newspaper and figuring out baseball stats. I learned how to read because I wanted to read the sports stories that were in the Los Angeles Times. And that's how, I really kind of moved myself forward, was I was so into sports all the time. And 72 was the year that you had the Trojans went undefeated, won the national title in football. My UCLA Bruins, I know that sounds strange that I like both, but I love all my LA teams.
I thought that was illegal. I thought that was illegal.
It's not illegal. I'm going to change it, damn it. And so that my Coach Wooden, I'm a big Coach Wooden fan. They went undefeated and won. My Lakers break through, and they win in 72 with the great Jerry West on that team. And so it was this golden year that year, and I was always a big Rams fan, and they even had a good season that year. So any and all of that was really important to me growing up. And so I got really turned on to all kinds of sports as a kid. And then just growing up in Venice, I was fortunate. I'm one of like 60 first cousins, and I'm towards the bottom of that. But many of us lived in the Venice area. So you always had a game to play with all of your cousins, let alone everybody else that might have lived on a very active block or two that I grew up on. And Venice at that time, was a place that was, it was eclectic, if you will. It certainly had its hippie, post-bohemian kind of vibe to it, but it also had a lot of families that were residing. And I was only a mile from the beach, so I was always able to get down to the beach and play on the Venice Beach courts as a kid, play beach volleyball down that way, and then went to high school not far from me in Playa del Rey. So kind of grew up in beach communities, but really had an existence that was really important on my block and in my backyard.
So did you spend a lot of time playing with all those cousins, just pick up sports all over the place wherever you could find it?
You bet.
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that, it's kind of been a running theme through our podcast, just how much personally I miss. I'm 50, and I miss that for my own kids, that they didn't have the same opportunity to just go out and wander the neighborhood or wander the city and find games of, again, whatever it is. I mean, I think about the amount of backyard football I played, or one-on-one baseball, or obviously a lot of basketball. And now, if you were to tell a kid that's 12, 13 years old, hey, I used to play one-on-one baseball, they would clearly look at you like you were crazy.
Like, what do you mean? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we did it all the time. And, and I've heard a couple of other podcasts, which I very much enjoyed. But one of the themes I also hear was that thing like I learned by going down to Venice Beach and playing on the courts there was you got to win to stay on. Yep. And that was the same thing, whether I was playing at Rustic Canyon Rec or Pemar Gym or the Mar Vista Gym. It didn't matter. We go find where the best games were. And you got to win to stay on the court. And that really kind of forged something in you as an athlete, I think.
Did you have a favorite at any point, or did your favorite switch kind of as you were growing up at different seasons or different ages?
Yeah, it tended to be that. It tended to switch at different times. But if I really did have to pick, it might have to be basketball. A lot of people would be surprised. I was probably a little better in football. I wasn't bad in basketball. I was probably a little better maybe in football. And I was probably best at volleyball. And I made a name for myself, running large volleyball tournaments and being an announcer for Women's Pro Beach and all that kind of stuff. But I think basketball really runs through my heart. And a lot of it, I think, has to do with the idea that you could have this solitude. You could have this time to yourself where you could be creative and let your imagination roam. And I just would go find the outdoor courts, whether it was in my backyard or it was the local Catholic school that I went to, or perhaps it was the junior high. And I would dribble my basketball everywhere. And it meant everything to me. And just to be able to have those times to get away. I mean, anytime that I had stress in my life or excitement in my life, I celebrated by going and shooting hoops. And so I think there's something about that really gets down in you about basketball.
Yeah, I think that's one of the unique things, and one of the things that we hear a lot from people who played multiple sports as a kid. And one of the reasons why they tended to gravitate towards basketball was just the ability to kind of go out and lose yourself for a couple hours on the court. Whereas most other sports, it's not nearly as fun to practice baseball or volleyball or football by yourself as it is with basketball. You can use your imagination, and there's things that you can honestly work on and improve and get better, where it's a lot more difficult, I think, to do that in some of the other sports. And so I think people tend to gravitate towards basketball, people who that's appealing to. That's not appealing to everybody. Not everybody likes being the solitary player out on the court for 2-3 hours shooting. Some people need obviously that social piece and the interaction, but I think basketball does kind of attract those solo practitioners, which is also interesting because basketball played at its highest level obviously is you're most successful when you play a team game. So it's this solitary part of it that sometimes attracts players, and yet you have the team piece of it too.
Yeah, and it was also, some of my earliest memories right out of the gate were the back end of the Wooden years. So by the time, I was 6 years old or so, I can remember, being aware of Coach Wooden's teams at that time and just fascinated by how great they were, that they would always win. As a matter of fact, there's this one picture that I have that we use sometimes as a logo for our show. And it's on my first Holy Communion, and I'm shooting like a Kareem skyhook.
I saw that picture. That's a good picture. Okay, I love it.
That's the morning of my first Holy Communion, and you'll notice I got my black socks on because I would only wear black socks if I had to go to church. But I'm knocking down some of those skyhooks, and my mom's calling for me, and I'm like, Mom, I got to knock down 10 in a row. That's my thing. And she's like, honey, this is your first Holy, and she just gave up and took the picture, which is, I love that about her, that she understood what kind of kid I was, and I better knock down 10 before I could go receive a sacred communion.
That's awesome. That is awesome. That picture, when I see that, I can think of many, many vintage pictures of me, like with cut off jeans and no shirt on out in my driveway, shooting baskets with the same style of photo in terms of like the trim around the photo and just, getting it developed. Like start talking to kids today about having to go get your film developed and not knowing what that picture looks like.
No doubt. It's great because that picture, I had it in some random scrapbook and I pulled it out, and my mom died about coming up on almost 4 years ago. And so as I was launching into this venture that we're doing now, I turned it over and it's just in her handwriting. And it's Den, First Holy Communion, 1972. I started cracking up. I was like, Mom.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's a great story. It's always great. Yeah. That's funny, too. The other thing that I always think about with my childhood photos, and I'm sure you're the same way, is you think about the photos that your family had, you probably know and recognize and understand the story behind just about every photo because there just wasn't very many of them. And now, like my own kids, like photos are so disposable, and we have literally thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And so not any one picture holds the same significance for my kids as those photos, those family photos held for me. And I think that's, again, just a piece of nostalgia that I always hold on to, because I remember every single family photo and can tell you the stories behind them. And my kids won't be able to do the same thing. Especially
if you're like me, I'm number 7 in my family. So we have plenty of, my older sisters.
Right,
and, I remember when, that guy was cool. I liked him. He would play with me. That kind of stuff in the backyard or whatever. So, yeah, it is interesting to look back on that. And it's such a, different time now. Like, I played at a heavy hit in high school basketball. And I could say maybe the only photos I have of me playing there are from the yearbook. Like, my folks, they come to games, but not really. But they wouldn't bring a camera.
Exactly.
That didn't happen. Yeah.
Well, and that was expensive. It was expensive to take photos and develop them, and then you had no idea, especially if you're shooting action shots. The odds of you getting a good picture that way.
Yeah, that's so true.
The odds were stacked against you. All right, so you've mentioned your fascination with Coach Wooden, so I want to get to that in a second. But before we do, let's go back to your fandom as a Los Angeles sports fan.
Yeah.
Who were the athletes when you were a kid that you looked up to in each of the sports?
So I'll tell you, it's pretty fascinating that I guess it would have been last week or so that I had an opportunity to actually interview 2 of my childhood heroes. And that's something else, right? So one of them was Bob Klein, the tight end for the Los Angeles Rams, and then eventually for the San Diego Chargers. And he was part of the 1967 USC National Championship football team. And so I loved, football, of course, and so forth. And so that was one of the guys. And I had a good arm and I could throw it, but I was kind of slow. So it was difficult for me to always win a quarterback spot, but I could catch. And I wasn't as fast as a receiver. So as a tight end, that was kind of my game. And I quickly learned who the Los Angeles Rams, tight end was. And that was Bob Klein. And I found out, that he actually went to St. Monica High School, which I went to St. Bernard, and that was the rival. And I was like, wow. And it was like all of a sudden tangible for me that there's just this guy that theoretically went to a school like I go to that plays pro football. Like, it blew my mind, right? And I just got to interview him. His series is kind of playing right now on my YouTube. And then the other one that really was unbelievable was this 1971-72 Los Angeles Lakers. So people wouldn't know that are younger than 50, and I'm going to guess you may not know unless your grandparents forced you to watch the Lawrence Welk Show. But my older cousins are the Lennon sisters, and they were particularly famous for a while. And they were on this Lawrence Welk Show, and then the oldest one is one of my older cousins. She was my godmother. Her husband, Dick Gass, was really cool. He would take me to Rams games, Laker games, stuff like that, like things that my dad could never afford or would just, do, right? So I got to go to these big-time games, and it blew my mind. Here's the thing. Right up the street at what was then Loyola University, or maybe it changed to Loyola Marymount, the Lakers would practice in that gym. It wasn't far from where I lived as a kid in Venice. And Dick Gass would pick me up, and he was friends with Bill Sharman, the coach. And I got to go to as many as 8, maybe even 10 Laker practices that year. I would watch my heroes practice. So I would sit on like the bottom row of a bleachers, and I would watch Gail Goodrich and Jerry West, right? Keith Erickson was on that team. I kind of knew somebody. Wilt Chamberlain. You got to be kidding me. It was nuts. Like, I would sit there, and then they would go get water. I'd run out. I'd grab the ball, take a couple of half-hearted shots, try to, like, miss in the direction of Jerry West so he might throw the ball back to me, do that kind of stuff. And that fascinated me, and I followed that team religiously. That was a team that won 33 games in a row on the road. That in where I grew up, there's a McDonald's not far from me, and all the kids like to go to McDonald's. But across the street, Der Wiener Schnitzel. I was a Der Wiener Schnitzel guy. You know why? Because they put out the commemorative photo of the Lakers that had won 33 games in a row. So I switched. I left the Golden Arches for the Mustard Dog, and I was like so big, and I had that. I put that up in my room, and I felt like I knew those guys. I felt like I was that part of that team. And when they finally beat the Knicks, it was something else. I felt like I was actually maybe part of this championship, and that was really what cemented my love of basketball and just being a Los Angeles sports fan.
Yeah, that's amazing to be able to have that kind of access that you can sit in and watch practices, and then clearly you have some legendary players on that team, and then that team becomes a legendary team with their 33 in a row and winning 69 games, and until the Warriors ended up beating that record, or until I guess the Bulls beat it first, and then the Warriors surpassed Chicago. But
and Jerry West had a hand in both of those, right?
Exactly.
So he was on the 72 team, but he was the one of the architects of building that Golden State roster, and so he's really a fascinating guy. And then when he came to my house. He came to my house and he walked in, and I was like, it's like Babe Ruth walked in the door. He's still a really good looking guy. He stands tall and he walks in and he just got this aura about him. I'm like, Jesus, just sitting there interviewing him every once in a while. I'm trying to be a journalist, but I just go, Jesus, that's Jerry frickin' West right in front of me. What the hell? So it was, that was pretty cool. So I love that 72 team. And of course, I could just point to all points of my life where the Lakers, were part of my life. And I'm so fortunate, right? 17 NBA titles, and many of them happen, of course, here in Los Angeles. And getting all of those are touch points in my life, whether I was, like a teenager, enjoying the Magic years, or just growing into my young 20s, to turning my kids on to the next era with Kobe and Shaq, taking my kid to go see, Shaq play at the Forum, where he was on my shoulders and Shaq walked by us, and he asked if Shaq was human, right? My kid goes, is he human, right? Because he was just massive, right?
Yeah.
And then my son's favorite player is Kobe, and to go to the Staples the first year it opens, and my son we're sitting up way up in the 300 section, and he goes, Dad, you think Kobe will do a 360? And I said, Vaughn, NBA players don't do that in the middle of basketball games. And he's like, yeah, but Dad, he knows how to. I said, I know he knows how to, but they just don't do that in the middle of a game. Well, after the introduction happened, it was within the first 2 minutes. He picked a ball, went down and did a 360. Now, you talk about somebody being a lifelong Kobe fan. That's my boy, right? He was just like, I told you,
Called
and
the shot.
that was his guy, evermore. And sadly, coincidentally, Kobe died on my son's birthday. That's how I found out. I called my son to say, hey, happy birthday. He's 28 now or whatever. And that was that day. Isn't that crazy?
Wow. Yeah.
But yeah, so I could point to all of these touch points in my life that the Lakers have been like a part of it. And then, this year when, all parts of the country are suffering, we know that, but out in LA, beyond what we're dealing with the pandemic and with the civil unrest and stuff, LA's really good at celebrating championships and controversy, like we're really good at rioting and we're really good at celebrating championships. And so the fact of the matter was that there was this little breath of light, right? Because we got the fires that are burning and all these things are going, and to see that the Lakers, pulled it out this year was pretty cool that we had that. So, people ask me about like what turned you on to basketball, or why that's it. It's just that we're so fortunate to have this franchise out here that has provided that many memories, for me and for everybody.
Yeah, that proximity to winning, I think obviously clearly helps cement fandom. I want to ask you about, thinking back to when you were a kid sitting on those bleachers, what was your impression of Wilt Chamberlain back in those days? Do you have anything that stands out about him? Clearly he was not the same Wilt Chamberlain that he was when in the early 60s when he was putting up 50 a game. But just like your son saying, is Shaq human? I think Wilt had sort of that same larger than life sort of persona and body and just reputation. So what do you remember about seeing Wilt Chamberlain out there on the practice floor?
There was a couple of things, and again, I'm young, but I did learn a little bit by hanging out with the adults after. So one of the things I got to do at the first couple practices I went to, of course, I'm just in awe. I'm probably like, just shaken overall that all of these guys are out there and how big they are and all this stuff. And I certainly love me some Wilt. I always had a headband and sweatpants. So I go back with my godfather, Dick Gass, to Bill Sharman's apartment. He lived in what's called the Marina Towers, and they were new at the time, and the Marina wasn't that old either. And so it was a chic place to live. And while the adults talked, I got to go into Bill Sharman's trophy room. And I don't know if you know this about Bill Sharman, but he was a great baseball player. In fact, he got pulled up to the Brooklyn Dodgers the day Bobby Thompson hit that shot heard around the world. He was on that bench. So he has this like long history of not only being like a okay professional baseball player, but then of course a great, Boston Celtics. So I'm looking at all these trophies And I'm like, wow, look at this guy, man. He's so accomplished. And so I go out and I hear him tell a story about Wilt. And basically what he said was, you never tell Wilt what to do, right? Now, I'm a Catholic school kid, and the nuns tell you what to do all the time because there's violence behind it if you don't. So you always do it, right? So he's like, you never tell Wilt what to do. I just make 2 suggestions, and I make one seem a little better than the other, and hopefully he takes that one. And I just remember like that lesson as a kid and going, wow, you're so clever. So when I went back to another practice and watched, I was always tripping out on Wilt. Wilt would take all kinds of breaks. He would always go and he'd just kind of sit down while the rest of the guys, when they went to go run stuff, he would step off to the side. And I came to learn later about his nightlife. And also, he loved to cross-train and play beach volleyball. So he would do these 2 things. He would go down to the beach. He'd like stay out all night having his party. And then he would go down to the beach to sweat it out in the morning and then come to practice. And so he would sit out a lot of practice. And so that is one thing that always stood out in my mind. And I put all those pieces together later in life. And then the rest of it was, you could just see like this. He was not your typical, plodding 7-footer. This guy could run. And he could jump and stuff. And it was that interested me as well, because even at the time, Lou Alcindor was really, or at that point, he'd become Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He was really athletic and he graceful, but he didn't run and jump like Wilt did. Something looked different to me about Wilt. And anyway, so I always loved those matchups when the Bucks would play the Lakers, to see those 2 giants go at it, and to know that, I'd seen Wilt in practice with sand on his legs.
Yeah. I always have had a fascination ever since I was a kid with Wilt, and never have really seen him play, obviously, live, or never saw him play a full game. But to the same extent, I just think that you look at the things that he was able to accomplish, and you hear people talk about him, and just the fact that I look at his athleticism, and you mentioned it, just the way he ran and the way he was able to jump and how athletic he was for a 7'2" guy. And when I think back into that era of basketball, and I think about who are guys that you could plug into today's game,
right,
and they'd be able to have maybe not the same quite level of success, but I think you could take Wilt Chamberlain of 1962 and not do anything right, different. Not even move him into like the modern, he's training the same way guys do, but just take the actual 1962 Wilt Chamberlain and put him in the league today, and he would still be a top 10 player in the league. I truly believe that. Yeah,
he was unbelievable, right? I mean, you got to figure, like he was with the Globetrotters for a couple of his years that probably would have, smashed the NBA, I guess. And then he jumped over to the Philadelphia Warriors or whatever. But it's crazy, like the life he had to, because he was with the Globetrotters. He used to play in the Catskills all the time and make some money on the side when he was still in college, I guess at Kansas or whatever. He just had like such a fascinating life. I mean, I know we've all seen documentaries on him, but I think he would make for a great like bio doc.
Yeah, I agree. He's one of the most fascinating people, I think, in the history of basketball, just from a standpoint of what he did on the court. And yet he still had these shortcomings when you compare it to Bill Russell in terms of the winning. And so you have that piece of it. And yet at the same time, he did win championships. He did play on that 72 Lakers team.
Yeah, he had two. He had two.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not like he didn't win, but he didn't win, obviously, to the same level as Russell. And yet you just look at the statistical case for Wilt Chamberlain being, and again, you can think about ranking him wherever you want to rank him, but it's hard to argue against his statistics. Let's put it that way.
I like those talks about rank the players. I know some people shy away from them, but I enjoy them. But yeah, and F the Celtics, by the way. Can I just say that? I'll tell you, I mean the Celtics of those days. Here's the thing. They got, okay, I'm going to give Red Auerbach credit. The guy could draft. He could evaluate talent, and he was fine as a coach. But without free agency, once he loaded his roster, yeah, they're going to win most of the time. Man, Jerry West was putting up a fight and going through the tragedy of having to bow out to the Celtics just short, 8 times. That's unbelievable. Like, Jerry West might very well be considered the best player ever had free agency been a thing back then. And Absolutely. Some of those, that Celtic team had broken up just a little, let alone guys like Wilt that were in their own conference with them. And so, anyways, I also like to say F the Celtics.
Jason and I condone Boston Celtics bashing on this podcast, so we're good. We're good. We're good with that.
We're two of the most avid Bill Simmons listeners there are.
I love it.
We just can't stand them. So
I like it.
Boston.
I have a long history of disliking the Celtics. So in the Bird Magic heyday, I was squarely in the Magic court. I've come around probably on Larry Bird. If you'd asked 16-year-old me and then asked my dad, who kind of liked Larry Bird, how much I despised and hated Larry Bird when I was 16, that was pretty well off the charts. And I've come as an adult to respect what Larry did and who he was as a player.
Yeah, Larry, he was no joke. I'll give him that. But hey, think of what Magic did. Magic won the state title as a high school senior. He goes to Michigan State. One year, I think they bowed out, maybe second round or whatever. Then he wins with Michigan State, and then he wins as a rookie in the NBA. So he goes state title, high school, NCAA title, and NBA title within 4 years.
Magic was incredible. Look, he was a guy who was way before his time at his size to be able to do the things that he did. You can count on one hand the number of guys that had the vision as a passer that he had, and obviously the game is played a lot different now than it was back then. So you look at comparing eras, and it's really hard to do. But I don't think there's any doubt. Just like we talked about Wilt, I think you could take Magic and put him into any era, and he would just be phenomenal. What's funny about Magic is that if you look at him purely from if you judge how good an athlete is by how high they can jump and how fast they can run,
he doesn't.
I don't think Magic doesn't rank when it comes there, but just as far as a basketball IQ,
that's it.
Clearly, that's where he's just off the charts as a basketball IQ guy and a winner, and I mean, a leader and a guy that other people wanted to play with and play for.
And while I'm in, I got to also shout out our long family dog that died recently. I named him Buck because that's what Pat Riley called Magic. Yep. Called him Buck, right? Yep. So our dog's name was Buck Magic Lennon, and I just got to, as long as I'm shouting out some stuff, but yeah, and he was a great dog. But I mean, if you're going to name your family dog after a basketball player, that's pretty high compliment. That's a pretty high compliment.
That's it. I agree. Yeah. All right. Let's jump into your Jerry West stuff.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about how you obviously got a chance to watch him when you were a kid. Yep. Tell me how you reconnect with him as an adult. Just kind of go through the story of how you guys got together, and then we can dive into some of the things that you've been able to talk with him about over the last, couple weeks, couple months that you've had this relationship.
Yeah. So, I've actually had two encounters with Jerry West as an adult. One, I was an athletic director at a private school on the west side of Los Angeles in Brentwood, California. That was and so I was at the school, and one of the parents said, "Hey, I might be able to get to Jerry West." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. He's pretty good friends with one of my older, cousin-in-law, anyways." And so I guess he recognized my last name. And he owed her a favor or something. So he comes to the school. Now, it's an all-girls school. And he comes there to speak. And a lot of those girls are at the school. It's not that they're girls. It's just that they're younger athletes. And they're more familiar with Steph Curry than they are with Jerry West, right? Because Steph is lighting up the league right then. In fact, he comes to my school the day after Golden State had won what would it have been, the 73rd game? Yep. In the regular season, right?
Yep.
Okay, so he comes the day after, and that happened to be the night Kobe.
Correct, the same night, that he scored 60. Yeah.
So he shows up. I say, "Hey, how's it going? I think you might know some of my family, the Lennon family." He goes, "Sure." So I'm escorting him around the school, and we're talking, and I say, and people are asking him, because people have a hard time in Los Angeles not thinking of Jerry West as a Laker. Like, they didn't follow, like they didn't get it. Like he went to the Grizzlies and then the Warriors and the Clippers. Like they don't get it. They can only see him in their eye as a Laker, right? So they're coming up to us. Can you believe what Kobe did last night? And he goes, "Well, I was watching a team play." That's what he said. He said, "I was watching a team play." So he had flown that morning, like back from San Francisco or whatever, or Oakland, to come and do the speech at the school that I was at. And anyways, the reason I said that is because I started to learn a little bit about him that day. He's a very self-assured guy, but he's also a very dark guy because he's got a lot of tragedy in his life. But he was very self-assured, and he turned to me at one point. I guess he got comfortable with me. he got 60 points on 50 shots. You give me 50 fucking shots, I'll drop 90. That's what he said. Can I curse on your show? Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. You're
okay,
good.
especially if I'm quoting Jerry West, I think it's okay. He goes, you give me 50 fucking shots, I drop 90. I just about fell out. I thought that was hilarious. And so he goes, I ain't going to that. I didn't go to that dog and pony show. I went to go see a team do a team accomplishment. Anyways, I found that really interesting. And then he got up, and I really didn't get to interview him. He said, I wrote something, and he was so forthright, and he spoke so openly about his tortured relationship with his father, about how his mother was distant to him, about his brother dying in the Korean War, how alone he felt, where he grew up in West Virginia, and it was beautiful. And you watch the room go from, this is the guy that knows Steph Curry, to, oh my God, this is a guy my grandfather loves. And then it was, everybody that was there started to almost, cry. And because it was so dramatic what he was telling you about in his life. And I really came to respect him a lot for sharing that part, talking about depression, talking about civil rights and his role in all of these things other than basketball. And that really got me a lot more fascinated in him. So once he kind of finished that day, then he left. And he was coming down off the stage, by the way. It was kind of like a slightly staggered stage that was set up for like a orchestra performance. And he slipped just a little bit. And now it's a bunch of people around him. He's 80 years old or whatever. So it's a bunch of people around him that suddenly like reached over as if they're going to catch him. And he goes, I'll never fucking fall. I love this. I love the guy. I was like, oh my God, this guy is so confident. So now I finished up as an athletic director. I just felt like that time of my life was over. We made a big plan to get into video podcasting and just to tell the stories that I had accumulated over my life. And so I said, I bet I could get Jerry West back on the show. So I went through my older cousin. His name's Wayne Boley, and I got to give him credit. Wayno talked to him, and he waited. He said, yeah, we'll get around to Denny. And then when he thought I was good enough, which is a big thing in my family, I could tell you a story about my Uncle Jim, the boxing announcer, when I first started announcing. But Wayne said, yeah. And then he goes, I really like your stuff, Denny. It's really good. I'm going to ask Jerry. And so Jerry said, yeah. And before they went to go play golf in Long Beach, he rolls by my house. I'm not far from Los Angeles International Airport. And they roll by here. And so that's how Jerry came here. And so we got down to it, and it was a really, it was, I got to say, it's the most interesting interview I've done because both of the person that Jerry West is and the unbelievable life he's led, but also because he truly is dark and troubled, and he has a hard time expressing happiness. And that stuff you hear on other podcasts or you hear when he's interviewed, it's true. I went out of my way to try to steer away from, I think people have heard about his dad and his brother and stuff. I purposely tried to find stuff he hadn't answered before, and he would start to answer that question, and inevitably it would lead him back down about growing up in West Virginia. I didn't want to go home. Things like that. Like he would alternately say, after we won the state championship as a high school, in like 59, they won the Virginia high school to state championship. They had this day where they renamed East Bank West Bank because he went to East Bank High School, whatever, and they renamed it West Bank. And then I said to him, well, do you think they would have done that if your last name was Horowitz? Right? Nothing. It's like crickets. And I go, well, I mean, if your name was like South or North, it fits, but he's like, nothing. And he goes, well, it just made me embarrassed because I don't like talking in front of people. And it really made me embarrassed, but made me feel like maybe I was special. But then I went home and I'm like, damn, like it's constantly there. It's always there, that what his relationship with his father, his mother distant, his brother dying at a formative age, all of that is always there, and it plays itself through him. And it's both what drove him to be great, and it's what drives him to be a very generous man these days. It's what also, growing up in those poor circumstances, has driven him to be much closer to those of his own economic status, irrespective of race. And he that's why he, I think, clicks so well with so many of the NBA players, because he gets where he came from and what drives him. And I think that's a big part of him. So going through all of that part of his life with him was where we spent a lot of the interview. And it was really cool, man, because when he starts to talk about, I was really interested in the transition from high school to college, but he played. So I take that back. It was 59 when West Virginia lost in the NCAA finals, and he was named the most outstanding player, right? It was like 54 or whatever when West Virginia won the state championship high school, or East Bank won. But 59, and then he plays 60, and he goes to the Pan Am Games in Chicago, and he talks about how his team whooped all the amateur teams, but at the times they had like a round robin kind of tryout to be on the Olympic team for the Olympic team trials. And so you'd have these AAU teams, right? But those were really like men that just didn't play pro basketball because there's no money in it. So they would play for their local like tires, company or automobile industry. And then they would have these guys that they would just hire that were good ex-collegiate players. And so that was like the AAU circuit kind of in those days, right? Because he really didn't have too many younger players coming along until much later for AAU. So then it was almost like minor league baseball teams of guys that just couldn't make the bigs. And so they would have this, and he said he whooped them all. And he goes, that's pretty much, they had to take 7 guys from our team because we won that. And that's how he made the Olympic team. And I was super fascinated in that because I knew he was on that 60 team with like Oscar Robertson. They were they were the co-captains, and they went over and they ran the place. But that's where Cassius Clay made his name, Rayford Johnson, Wilma Rudolph. I mean, those 60 games in Rome were gold. And he got to tell all of these stories about being over there. And that's the stuff that like really fascinated me. And I saw, a little bit more Jerry West, I think, than you normally see. But it didn't take long for him to, I would say, I would imagine some of your social justice or your ability, was part of that Olympic movement. And he would quickly kind of segue out of that into something else. And then he would go back to telling a story about where he came from and how happy he wasn't, to not be from there. And it was really sad, dude. It was like, it was really sad, but it was also like fascinating.
It's amazing that figuring a guy in his 80s is still kind of carrying that with him. It just shows you how powerful and how much you're imprinted what happens during your childhood, and that you take that with you throughout your entire life. And no matter what kind of success you have, you always kind of go back to the roots when you think about the sources of your success or your failures, or you think about what you wanted or needed or had from your parents and your siblings and your family. And you can just see that there's a lot of people that are carrying those things with them, and many of them aren't public figures, so they don't ever get a chance to share that or have a way to be able to express it. A lot of people just carry that with them all the time. I think one of the things that I'm probably most fascinated with when it comes to Jerry West is the fact that here he was, a guy who was an unbelievable player. And as you said, had things been slightly different during the 60s, he could have won 3, 4, 5, 6. He could have been the Bill Russell of that era. And yet, so there's a guy who arguably is a top 10 player in the history of the NBA. And yet he goes on to become arguably maybe the top executive in the history of the NBA. And it's very, very rare that you see somebody who gets to the top of their profession in one area and then changes and ends up getting to the top in a completely different profession. Because obviously the skill set that you need to be a great NBA player is completely different from the skill set that you need to be a great NBA executive. So I would be curious as to, and I don't know if you got a chance to talk to him about it, but I would be curious about when he made the transition, did he know that that was something that he wanted to get into? How did he fall into those jobs? Was it something that he was pursuing? And then just how did he go about studying his craft and getting to be as good as he was at his second career? So
the transition for him, actually, he was a coach for the Lakers, and this would have been one of the down periods of Lakers. So I think he retired, 74? And this is, there's like a year before they acquire Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And it's not going to be until the 79 until they get Magic, right? So Jerry West was like the coach, 75, 76 or whatever, 77. He got that team into the playoffs and almost at a level of contending. And they had a terrible roster. Like, they were not very good. I think he only had Kareem for 1 year. So they were not very good at all. And he coached like at about a 70% clip or something like that. But what he said is it killed him. It just about killed him. He could not take the losing and not having enough control over the situation. And he also had that classic thing where great players always have it, which is you're not working hard enough. Like, you didn't do it like I did. So I think that laid below the surface, but he was smart enough to know to try to approach the players on a different level. But what really beat him down was the losses. And he didn't want to keep going through that anymore. And so I think they then offered him a transitionary. They appointed Pat Riley. It had this really bizarre press conference where Jerry Buss, it might have been Jack Kent Cook still. He has this bizarre press conference where he calls Jerry West is going to be the defensive coach and Pat Riley is going to be the offensive coach. And they had never discussed that before. No, but they never discussed it behind. He does this at the press conference, and Jerry Buss immediately gets up behind the microphone and goes, "Yeah, that won't be what's happening. Pat Riley's going to be, and I will transition out of the way, right?" And so that's where he kind of like moved in to the front office at that point. And Bill Sharman was in the front office at that point. I think he might have been the president. And so Bill Sharman became one of his tutors in that world. And here's the one guy that took the 72 team, right? He got Jerry West to be more of a distributor that year. So Jerry West had a career high in 72 in assists. He got Wilt to give up scoring so that he'd be more of a defensive player. And Wilt had one of his lowest scoring ever. And and then Gail Goodrich exploded, and so did the other component parts. And so Bill Sharman was the one who was able to take all of those people and turn them into a team that won the championship. And I think Jerry West probably really respected that and then allowed himself to learn from Bill Sharman in his time as the president. And that was his transition into moving into that. And what he said he loved was scouting. He loved getting on the road, going somewhere, finding somebody. Because you got to remember, like, Jerry West, Vlade Divac would have been one of the first successful foreign players, maybe? I'm trying to think of who else was a foreign player that came over that was...
Yeah, in that area you had probably Drazen Petrovic.
Yep.
I'm trying to think who else would have been. Sharunas Marshalonis was one of the first first European players to come over. Sabonis followed them when he was past his prime. Right, he was well past his prime by the time he got here. So,
but Vlade came over and was great. And that was the other thing. Like, it was so funny. Mike, it was so funny. I was like, I would go, yeah, what cracked me up about Vlade was because being in LA, you get the LA news, right? Because this is before SportsCenter and all that stuff. So you get that 10 minutes at the end of your local newscast. And our newscaster guy was like Jim Hill or something, and he would be in there interviewing Vlade in the locker room, and Vlade would have his shirt off, and he did not look like an athlete, and he'd be smoking a cigarette.
Right, exactly.
Right? Vlade would be like, on a smoker, and he's a very personable guy, and it used to crack me up. I was like, oh, dude, this European. But then you watch him play, you're like, oh, baller. Like, geez, that guy's great passing center, and he was like great for that team. So anyways, I kind of cracked that to Jerry West. Nothing. He just moved on to the next thing. Right? And I was like, okay. I was really trying to get a handle on how this interview is going. On the back side of that, he was very complimentary to my cousin or whatever when they were playing golf later that day. It was very complimentary. He said, I thought it was a great interview. He was really well prepared. He asked me some things I didn't think people knew. So on and so forth. But in it, oh my goodness, I felt like I was him playing the Celtics.
Yeah, I believe it. It's interesting when you have an opportunity to talk to somebody who you've seen or admired from afar, or at least someone who's a celebrity to some degree. You kind of have a different feel for it. And then what I found is that kind of once you get into it and you start talking to them, and as long as that person opens up and is willing to allow themselves to be interviewed, then it usually goes pretty well.
Yeah,
but certainly in the lead up though, you're a lot more nervous than you are if you're just interviewing, a local high school coach. There's no question about that.
No question. Yeah. So he did. He had some really introspective things to say. And it got towards the end. We started to get into some of the things of him being an executive, right? And I could just feel him wanting to get going. Like, because he went for more than an hour, which is really spectacular when you think about it. Like, he's not used to doing that. And he wanted to get to his tee time. I saw him look at his watch a couple times, and I was like, damn it. So I really didn't get to some of the stuff I wanted to at the end, because I kind of do my interviews not unlike how you do, where I like to do them on some kind of chronological base. Let's go from when you're a kid, all the way moving forward. But his moving forward isn't like I retired and became the vice president of a car dealership. His retirement is more spectacular than his playing career. And so I wanted to, as far as, retiring from a player. So I wanted to get to those points and ask him some of those things. And I think the last thing was, I'm sure you know this. Do you know how the ball is changing? The Spalding ball is out and the Wilson ball is in.
Yes.
Right? So I wanted to talk about that. And he goes, hey, the ball's round. I'm sure when they bounce it, it'll come back up. And I went, uh-oh. This guy wants to leave, right? I was like, okay, shit, I didn't even get to dive in like I wanted to the Kobe tryout, which I think I said something to the effect of like, Sonny Vaccaro, when he would find a player, he did everything he could to not be around because he didn't want everybody else to sniff it out too, right? And so it's kind of so Sonny Vaccaro would see a player doing a workout or something and go, I just pulled a Jerry West and crushed that and killed that practice. Because that's what Jerry West did not 2 miles from where I'm sitting right here at the Inglewood YMCA. Jerry West watched for about 20, 30 minutes and just shut the doors. And he's like, enough of that. I'm going to go make a deal right now. And maybe that was the same summer, 96, that he got Shaq and Kobe. So I got into that a little bit, but he was starting to get a little edgy. He wanted to go play golf. And so, I didn't get as much as I would have liked on that. But, man, I think the rest of it, because I was just watching some of it recently because we're going to divide it up into 4 parts. And we were watching some of it, and we're like, okay, that's really good. Like, it's cool, some of the stuff he says, but it's dark. Like, that's the one thing we kept saying. It's like, damn, this guy really, that's probably what drove him to be so great.
I agree. I think when you have – sometimes it takes, everybody's driven by different things, but certainly when you have the background that he had and it pushes you. And the fact, like I said earlier, that he still is carrying that with him and is still bringing it to the forefront during interviews tells you that that's something that is omnipresent with him all the time, no matter where he goes, no matter what he's doing. That's pushing him and driving him in some way. And who knows what that exact motivation looks like inside of his mind. But clearly, if he's expressing it in interviews, it's something that continues to drive him to this day.
I must say this too, very polite, like regal man. I almost liked him like a matinee idol, from those great films of old day, because he's just the way he carries himself, and he's got those great manners, and he's really, to me, was a cool kind of throwback kind of guy, and but it certainly is going to be something I always remember.
Yeah, no question about that. Being able to touch base with your childhood idol, I can't imagine that things don't get much better than that when you get to see somebody and talk to somebody who you looked up to as a kid, and then you get to interact with them on sort of, again, not necessarily a completely even playing field, but certainly an even playing field where it's 2 adults talking. You're having an opportunity to pick the brain of somebody that you watched as a kid. That's a special thing for sure.
I asked him one of my first questions. I asked him, I said, I don't want to embarrass you, Jerry, but when I was a kid, I used to pretend like I was you in my backyard, shooting hoop. And I said, I wonder, when I know you spent a lot of time shooting hoop on your own, did you ever pretend like you were like a local college or high school star, or anything like that? And he goes, no. He goes, you got to understand, they're 28 miles from everything around me. I didn't know what was going on in my world. I just knew I didn't want to be home. And I went, oh, okay. All right, cool. All right.
There you go.
And so right. But also he learned, so if you remember, do you know, if you watch a Jerry West film, you see how he takes that last dribble is particularly hard, and helps him elevate and get that right elbow up.
Shot. Yep.
Yeah, he was talking about that. He was saying, because I dribbled my basketball everywhere, a lot of times along the railroad tracks, across a creek, and that kind of stuff, I learned how to control it off of different objects all the time. And sometimes one of my tracks to where I would go play was over this dead wood, like that was next to the railroad track, something along these lines. And he goes, that's where I really learned to bounce the ball hard and keep my hand on top of it so that I could always control it. And I was just like, all right, that's cool. Like that's
very cool. That's a very cool.
I like that because he gets up on his jumper. Like he was, when you watch some of his highlights, he was hard to stop.
Yeah, absolutely.
He would
no
get
question
up.
about that.
Yeah,
yep.
He was so
very great shooter, and obviously a guy that could score in a multitude of ways. And just there's a reason why your nickname is Mr. Clutch. So
Mr.
you come
Clutch,
through. You come through, and the fact that your nickname is Mr. Clutch and
the logo.
The logo. But you think about that. You think about it. He's Mr. Clutch. He's the logo, and yet you look at his record in NBA Finals, and if he was around today, it's almost like he'd get slaughtered in the media, and yet the respect
he'd get the LeBron treatment. He'd get the LeBron treatment.
That's right.
But the respect that people would have for him, the respect that the people of his era had to have for him in order for those two things to happen, for him to have the nickname of Mr. Clutch, even though you're losing more than you're winning, at least in terms of the NBA Finals. Obviously, he won a lot of regular season games and had a tremendous amount of success, but still not winning the ultimate prize at the end of the season. And then for him to become the logo and be the face of the league in so many ways it's kind of an incredible story.
It's an incredible story. And he had so much respect from other NBA greats. That's the one thing that really stands out, is those guys always spoke so well of his ability, because he was they didn't have all defense awards until he was already like 31 or something years old. So his best defensive years were behind him, and he still got, I think, first team all defense or a couple of times, even though he was closing in on 33, 34. He was a great defender. Those stats just aren't afforded to him. And so he had that going for him, and as well as the scoring, and he would always hit those big shots. So, but the second, like you bring up, he'll bring up that he got two of the worst awards ever, or I forget what word he used for him, but because he was the most outstanding player of the Final Four in '59 when West Virginia lost by a point to Cal, and he was the MVP of the NBA Finals in '69 when the Lakers lost to the Celtics. So he's the only player to have done either of those. Like, that's crazy.
It is. It really is.
Right? And so that shows like the level of respect that's afforded to him. And he goes, there's not a day in my life I don't think about losing that game to Cal. Or he'll say things like that, and I'm like, damn, dude. Okay. That's why you're you. That's why you're Jerry freaking West. Like, that's, I get it. Like,
there definitely are losses that stick with you. I can vouch for Jerry West that there's some losses. I don't know I don't know if I think about him every day, but I definitely think about him that I'm like, ooh, that was an opportunity that I wish I had back. So I'm going to tell you my very, very brief Jerry West story, and it really doesn't have anything to do with Jerry West the person. But so when I was growing up, and I would go and I would play at the local courts down the road from where I grew up. So I'd hop on my bike, and I probably started going up there when I was 13, maybe something like that, and play with the guys who were in high school or college and adults. And I would go and I would always be the first one there so that I could get in that first game. And then after that, they're like, we're not picking up this skinny little 13-year-old.
Right.
Once the real players got there, then I kind of had to sit out. But I kept hanging around, and eventually, I made my way so I could play in the main events. But one of the guys that was up there lived sort of in my neighborhood, and he would walk to the courts from his house, and he kind of befriended me and took me under his wing. And at some point, and I don't remember the exact moment, but at some point, he was a guy who liked to give out nicknames. And so he would give out nicknames to all these different people on the court. And so he started calling me Jerry West.
Oh, nice.
And so there is a whole contingent. So from the time I was about 14 until I was probably 20, there is this whole contingent of people in my life that just called me West. And so,
that's cool.
Once
you could do much worse.
Yeah, exactly. And once I got out of that environment, though, there wasn't really, like I didn't take that nickname with me to college. Like I never referred to myself as West. It was never a nickname that kind of became universal. It was just in this one particular place in my life where people would use that name. And it's funny because I will still occasionally run into somebody from that era of my life, and I'll be with somebody of my life in my life now, or maybe somebody that I was with in college, and they'll be like, "Hey, West, how you doing?" And the people will look at me and they'll be like, "Who's he talking to? Like, what does he mean?" And then I have to go in and try to explain this whole thing that, at this one point, this guy who was like 27 and I was 14, and he decided he was going to start calling me Jerry West, and it caught on. And so it's just kind of funny. So I always feel like,
cool.
even though there's no real connection between me and Jerry West. There is this period of time where people, for whatever reason, based on this guy calling me Jerry West, there was a lot of people that called me West. So it's sort of a badge of pride that I
nice.
wear and take with me.
That is one of the beautiful things too about sports. I think that binds a lot of us is that those nicknames that, like I as a longtime coach, because I spent a lot of years as a coach of multiple different sports, different levels, and nicknames are important. They make you on some level have a deeper appreciation for the sport, because you don't get a nickname for answering a bunch of questions right, in your math class so much. You get these on the sports fields and in the arenas, and it's cool. And so for you to have that one to hang on to, that's pretty cool. That's all right. That's all right. Yeah,
it's very fun. All right, let's shift gears from Jerry West to John Wooden.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about why, obviously growing up in LA, you get the chance to see the tail end, as you said, of John Wooden. And by the time that you're around and you're a kid, sort of the legend of him is already there. But I think probably his legend has grown in stature even from where it was back when he was alive and back when he was actually winning his titles. He's probably more revered now than he even was in the moment.
That's right.
Just tell me a little bit about why John Wooden, beyond the fact that the geographic proximity, just tell me what it was that you respected about him. I'd be really interested to hear what your favorite John Wooden saying is, because I know you probably know thousands. If there are thousands of them that are out there, so I'm just curious which ones you like to pull up or refer to. So just tell us a little bit about your quasi relationship with John Wooden as a fan of his.
The only place you'll find success before work is in the dictionary is probably the one that sticks out the most to me. When I was born in '64, that's when John Wooden won his first NCAA, and it took him 16 years to get to that point at UCLA. His teams were always good, but it took him and then he kept winning until in '75. So, like I said, I came aware of him and his teams around '70. So I got those last few years of Coach Wooden, and I've been fortunate enough on the backside here doing these interviews to have just interviewed Andre McCarter, who was on that '75 team. His grandson-in-law, Craig Impelman, who has a lot of great stories. The guy who spent the last 13 years of his life, Lynn Shelton, with Coach Wooden and developed the John R. Wooden course, and Lynn Guerin, rather. And so I got close to it in these interviews. And Coach Wooden, here's the thing. I always revered him as this guy who won no matter what. It didn't matter. Like, Vietnam War is raging, and he's got Bill Walton. That's okay. He doesn't have Alcindor or Walton. He's got Wicks and Rowe. No problem. We're going to win. Like, the guy was a machine, right? He would just win, and that's what attracted me. So by the time, I went and I played high school basketball. Then I was playing junior college basketball, and I tore up my leg. I needed to make money, so I came back, took a PE coaching job, and became like the coach and then quickly the athletic director at the school. So I said, shoot, my teams are going to win like John Wooden's. I should get his book, figure out what he did, right? Yep. I get his book, and he spends almost all, it's not that much basketball in it. He doesn't even bring up the word win that much. It's talking so much about how important it is to be a good teacher, how it is to work with your players, not direct your players around, that you don't get the credit, you spread that credit around. All of those life lessons came from those first few books that I read of his, and it finally sunk in. Because when I started to coach, and I was young, I was 20, 21 years old, I coached a lot like I was coached, was a lot of yelling and a lot of focus on what a person did wrong without appropriate correction to what they did wrong. And I didn't feel good about it. And the more I read from Coach Wooden, the more I just said, okay, here we go. And I copied all of his drills, on a copier. That's what my assistant coaches at any of the lower level teams would coach from. Don't deviate from this. And we're going to use the pyramid of success as our guiding principle. And so are our players. And when I did that, everything turned around. I felt better about myself. My players felt better about themselves and performed at a much higher level. And I just thought to myself, why doesn't everybody do this? But the fact of the matter is, I kind of became the guy who knew about John Wooden and who put John Wooden. So my teams would always learn all of those quotes. We would always have them. eventually would make little magnets that were the Pyramid of Success. Those will go out to the player of the week. I started to name a practice player of the day at the end of every practice. Had nothing to do with the best player. Had everything to do with the player who had overcome something or made significant progress. All of the things that I learned from those wooden books started to really pay off because my teams, and it didn't matter what sport, started to do really well. And then my coaches that came from me started to do well. And I thought to myself that I had this market cornered. I didn't. There was people all around Los Angeles, if not the country, who had learned from the great John Wooden, who, as you said, was more revered, even though 10 championships in 12 years, more revered later in life as being the great teacher. So any and all of that just makes him one of the most fascinating people I've known. I always said that, like, my 3 favorite Americans when I would do my speeches to try to lure in new prospects to the school at open house days. So my 3 favorite Americans are Abraham Lincoln, John Wooden, and my mom. And they all have their reasons why. And John Wooden he ranks that high with me in my life. And I had one cool time. One of my ex-players was at Occidental College, and he gets a hold of me, and these are the days before cell phone, kind of right in that. He gets a hold of me through the main line at the school. I have to come in off the yard. I pick it up. He goes, "Coach." I go, "Hey, what's up, Serge?" He goes, "Look, John Wooden's going to be speaking at my school today." I said, "No, really?" He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "I can get you in." And I said, "I'm going to bring my kids with me." And he goes, "All right." So my kids are like, my boy Vaughn at the time was maybe 8, and my daughter Sienna was 5. Now, my daughter did not sit still ever, like ever, right? Everywhere we ever went, if I ever wanted to go to a restaurant, it was like you had to have multiple coloring and puzzles, and keep her, or I tell her to go walk around and collect all the yellow packets and bring them back to me, and I'll go put them back. Like, I had to occupy her all the time. We sat. My boy knew how important it was to me, so he just sat there and paid attention. I've never seen my daughter sit so still. She's 5 years old, and she is just focused on this guy. It's like he was a Buddha that was levitating up there on the stage, and she listened all the way through. And I thought, oh my God, there's something about this guy. Like, it goes so far beyond his coaching sports. He really, truly is like a transcendent figure. And we got a chance to go up and talk to him after. So, it was really nice. He said a couple nice words to me. "Oh, I'm glad you're teaching." He said something nice. There was people that were lined up 300 deep wanting to talk to him. He talked to my daughter for about 15 minutes. Like, he just sat there and was fascinated that she'd like written him she'd draw a cartoon or whatever and handed it off to him. He signed his name to Sienna Love, John Wooden. He asked her he sat there and talked to her. And I say 15, it was probably 4 minutes. You wouldn't believe what the line was getting like behind him. But I thought, God, this guy is something else, He's really something else. So, yeah, those are a couple of my John Wooden stories. I was fortunate enough that I got to coach his granddaughter on a team, and she got me a signed ball that says, "For Coach Lennon, best wishes, John Wooden, UCLA." So I always show that to any of my friends that come over. I go, "Look who calls me Coach." Calls himself John. I go by Coach. So, that and there's just so many of those stories. I think I'm not the only one who can tell these stories about John Wooden. I think he reached so many people's lives that was bigger than basketball, that he's truly like this great American.
Yeah, I think the thing that I always come back to with John Wooden is the fact that you kind of alluded to it, that a lot of the things that he did in terms of the way he instructed and not being the yelling drill sergeant type of coach, there was clearly an era in the 70s and 80s where that was the prevailing style of coaching. Yep. And it's kind of amazing that it continued to be, despite the fact that here was a guy who had more success than just about any coach in any sport, and he did it sort of the opposite way. And I think now we've come around, if you look at the way most coaches are going about their business today, it's much closer to the John Wooden style of coaching than it is to, I guess, yes. When I think of the antithesis of the John Wooden style, I think of Bobby Knight.
Bobby Knight, yep.
And so in the 70s and 80s, the Bob Knight style of coaching was far more prevalent, far more accepted. And not that Bob Knight didn't have some success with that, because clearly he did, and clearly there was a lot of great things about Coach Knight to go along with sort of the darker side of what he did. But when I think of John Wooden, I just think of a guy who was able to have success on the floor, but also was able to have such a huge impact on his players and on coaching and on society as a whole, off the floor. And to me, that's what really makes him special. The fact that his style of coaching has transcended eras and has, in essence, really started a new era of coaching. When you think about how coaches go about their business today. It's really fascinating, just the fact that he was around when he was, and that what he's done is still here today.
And you talk about another like biopic that would be unbelievable. You got to remember, like in 32, Purdue wins a championship with him as their player. He's the best basketball player in the country.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. He was great. Like, he was excellent. And then he made a little side money playing semi-pro baseball while he was, becoming like a teacher and a coach and stuff like that. So the guy was a terrific athlete in his own right, and then worked his way up. And he only comes to UCLA because a storm hit Minnesota and wiped out their telephone lines so that they couldn't call him to tell him that the offer was good. And then UCLA calls and he says, okay. And then when Minnesota called back with a better offer where he wanted to go, stay in the Big Ten, I've already given my word. And he goes out and he's in a horrible facility. He has to split the gym out at UCLA. They don't even have a home court. Like, they're playing at places like they have to play in the Shrine Auditorium, and they have to play over at Pan Pacific, and they play at Venice High School. They're playing in high schools, and they're UCLA, yet he's winning conference championships. So as a lot of people, and I alluded to it right away, it took him 16 years to win that title. He was winning the Pac-8, or it was then like the AAWU or whatever. He was winning that conference a lot. Like, his teams were really good, and they always were good. And he recognized the own faults in himself, and he corrected himself, and he moved forward. I just think he's a fascinating story of what can be done. And so I've always used his teachings, his motivational, that pyramid of success is just like kind of like a guiding light.
Yeah, there's no question about that. All right, I want to jump into Sports Stories with Denny Lennon. Give us the quick story of how you started it, why you started it, what the vision for it was and is, and where you see it going in the future. So after,
to make a couple of bucks when I was a teenager and stuff, I'd coached some little league teams and that kind of stuff and helped out, right? So I looked at it this way, I was 55 or something. So it was like 40 years I've been coaching. I've been, played a little bit, like as I mentioned, through college. I mean, not through college, but like only 1 year college or whatever. And so I've been coaching, administrating. I started in beach volleyball and grew that with a couple of key figures across the country. We started with a number of kids. We grew junior beach volleyball to become a competent sport. So I'd done all of those things, and I really enjoyed them. And I met a lot of people. I was fortunate, and I was having a good success as an athletic director at this high school. But something was gnawing at me, and I was like, I really think there's an opportunity here in this day and age that we can. You don't have to know somebody to get a TV show or to get into a magazine or whatever. You could just do this podcast. And I like podcasts. I like listening to some of them. And I thought, I think I could do that. And so we just jumped into it. Marley Rice, who got me up on the podcast and stuff, she was my administrative assistant over at that high school. And I go, how about making no money for a while and seeing if we can create a career and let's see what we can do. And that's how it started. So we immediately felt like, a video podcast would work well because we're going to be covering we're going to get to places that a lot of other people can't get to, because I'm fortunate through my family, through my AAU connections, through my past being an announcer on Women's Pro Beach and that kind of stuff. I could get to some places. And so that's what we started to do. And so what we do now, we kind of do a few different things. We have a couple of live shows that go on YouTube. We also do a sit-down video podcast. So those live shows, one of them is focused on the club to Olympian scene, prep sports to Olympian scene. The other one is kind of like the old Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, where guys come on and just kind of screw around, and we have some fun with it on a Friday night and do a cheers kind of, with the local restaurant provides with the margaritas. So that show gets a little crazy. But the Wednesday one, we keep the margaritas off, of course, because it's a Preps to Olympians show. And those both kind of caught on. They're doing well. One of them got syndicated to our local television station out here, LA 36. So that's working out. And then the video podcaster, I look at them like 60 Minutes. I love 60 Minutes, and which is not unlike what you're doing right now, right? It's like long form. It's not for everybody. It's for people who can maybe pay attention and dive into a story or whatever the subject might be. And so that's what we do. We drop on Thursdays. And then we started to add little segments. Like one of them that's really cool is there's this guy, Jonas Never, right? He's like a street artist muralist. And you've probably seen his work and didn't know you've seen it because he's done some great like Laker. He's did the Joe Kelly one, baseball. He's done the Kobe one. He's done a lot of these big, and a lot of them are they have a take on different sports. So there are murals all over Los Angeles, and we go and we just cover one of them on every Tuesday, and we just go and it's a one taker. I look at it. I kind of think about what it's about, and then boom, we just do a take on it, and we drop those on Tuesdays. So those are all the different things we do. We seem to be getting some traction here, and the audience is growing, and there seems to be more opportunities coming. So when you get a week like Bob Klein and Jerry West, your two boyhood heroes in the same week, I was like, damn. Like, hopefully I haven't peaked too early here.
That's pretty good.
That's pretty good.
That's pretty good. That's pretty good. So you're gonna have to do a lot to top yourself. All right. Before we wrap up, I want to give you a chance to share where people can find all the shows. Give them the information that they need in order to be able to go and check all this out.
Nice. Well, again, Denny Lennon, Denny like the restaurant, Lennon like the Beatle. So it's Sports Stories DL is what you got to remember. So on Twitter, it's easy enough at Sports Stories DL. My web address, where everything lives on our website, is at sports. It's sportsstoriesdl.com, and that's where they can find us. And YouTube is YouTube SSDL, which is, of course, eventually that's going to be like ESPN.
There you go.
Right? You're not even going to know what. Nobody knows what ESPN stood for originally. And so eventually, hopefully, I'm going to bring on some good young people, and they're going to take over for me, and I'll just lay back and see if the initials can do anything.
Love it. That's awesome. I think that, again, I'm fascinated by sort of the entrepreneurial journey of people and who are trying different things, and what you have going, and obviously what you've been able to do in the short time that you've been doing this speaks to the fact that I think you're going to have success going forward. So anybody who's out there listening in our audience, if you haven't had a chance to go and check out what Denny's doing, please check out Sports Stories with Denny Lennon. And I think you'll be impressed. And again, clearly, if you were fascinated enough to listen to this whole episode and hear us talking about Jerry West, you want to go and hear the exact actual interview that Denny did with Jerry. And I'm sure that you're going to come away.
December 17, we'll put it out for 4 consecutive Thursdays after that.
Perfect. So probably right about the time this thing is airing, our podcast, when it goes out, it'll be just about the time that your stuff will be out. So it'll work out perfectly. Denny, I cannot thank you enough.
Oh man, I thank you, Mike. And Mike, I got to tell you, Jason, I know you might be behind the scenes because I talk so much, but I know you're doing the work back there too, because I really do enjoy the shows that I listen to here. So you got me as a subscriber and a fan now. Awesome. And I'm only upset that we didn't get to talk about Bingo Smith from the Cleveland Cavaliers, because that was my guy back in the day.
I love Bingo. He was my favorite guy. Hearing Joe Tate call Bingo. There was nothing.
I can sadly say that I only know Bingo in name. I never saw him play. So
you guys will both appreciate this. Just the other night, I don't know, for some reason, my daughter and I were talking, and my daughter, who's 16, she's my sports fan in my family, and so her and I are usually the ones that end up talking sports. And so for some reason, I was pulling up, we were looking at something on her phone, and I can't remember exactly the genesis of it, but we pulled up the Cavs 1976 theme song, like disco theme song, and the Cavs will make it happen. And nice. So anyway, it was funny. So so I'm definitely down with Bingo. So maybe we'll have to have you back on to talk some Bingo Smith at some point.
I can talk my golden flashes.
All right, we can talk
Antonio Gates, too. Baby.
All right, so we're gonna come back, and after the fact, I've become pretty good friends with Trevor Huffman, who's the all-time leading scorer at Kent. He's 10 years younger than me, but he and I have become pretty good friends in the last in the last few years. So we're gonna have to definitely do that. And Denny, again, we can't thank you enough for jumping out with us tonight. Really appreciate it. And to everyone out there, thanks for listening, and we will catch you on our next episode. Thanks.